So one of the most noticeable things that we found up in this landscape is the way that the leopards are using time more than space. What we're seeing is sharing of space because it's an intensively used area. I mean, there are people that use the entirety of the landscape because they are either in the tea plucking or pruning or working, or they're in the forest patches gathering firewood, or the open areas getting fodder for the cattle. So there's people really using this landscape extensively. So during the day, what we're finding is humans. As you can see, this gentleman on the left-hand side at about 10:45 in the morning, and then that same location that night, we have another male. Again, this is a fellow working up at the dialogue tower, who's going up to his station for the night at about 6:30 in the evening, and an hour later there's a female coming down to check her regular marking spot on that trail, where she and a couple of other females were regularly going past and spraying. Another area, someone going back after a day of work with their dog, and an hour and a half later there's Arnold, actually, the same male, moving through the landscape. So it's a very distinct time period differences that humans and leopards are using the landscape. And when we looked at that a little more closely and we compared that to some data that we had from Wilpatu, from this very similar analysis where we again did an intense 4-month spatially explicit sort of population density analysis in Wilpatu in 2015. And so we had the same camera setup essentially as what we have in the hills, and we could compare the data fairly directly. And as you can see on a coarse level, the patterns are still similar. The leopards are more active nocturnally and less in the daytime. But if you look more closely, you see some quite dramatic differences. So in the Peak Ridge area, during the day, between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., there's almost no activity. We're getting almost no leopards on the cameras at all. In Wilpatu, by comparison, even though the level of activity is fairly low, there is still some. The animals are still moving a bit here and there. Then the second thing to really notice here is that large spike in the blue line right as night falls. So essentially these animals up in the peak area have been lying low, it seems like, for most of the day to avoid humans. And then as soon as night comes, they're up and they're active when the humans have gone back to the villages and their homes. And then they're fairly active for the first half of the night anyway. So then we can use this information when we're talking about coexistence of humans and leopards on the landscape. We give a lot of awareness programs up in these areas to schools, communities, tea estate communities, that sort of stuff, because obviously fear becomes an issue, especially when an incident gets into the newspaper, and there's been an incident of a leopard being killed or some conflict with a dog being eaten, that kind of thing. So a lot of people react with fear. So this gives a bit of an indication that really, I mean, you can see that these animals are actually working to avoid this kind of conflict. The time that you have to be more careful would be early morning as you're going into the fields, and then the evening as you're returning home. So those are the times to be a bit more aware that you might come across an animal. That kind of information we can transmit because of the data that we're getting here, and people are very receptive to that. And it does, when you're aware of something, your fears become alleviated, obviously. As Anjali mentioned, we're also we're doing this long-term monitoring here. So we've done these population studies, but we've also got some cameras up in the landscape that have been there for about 2 years now. So we're getting a bit of a longer slice than we normally get with the cameras. So this is just an example of some of the information. This is one location where we again had our friend Arnold. And then, and this was January of last year. The next month we had a different male in, literally the exact same location. And the following month, yet a different male came into that location. So we were able to kind of say, okay, what's going to happen here? Is this sort of an overlap zone? Is this nobody's territory? Is it somebody's? How's this going to play out? And so we did watch, and we got continued images, and we've seen that one of the animals came back, 2 of the animals came back, and in the end, by now, only Arnold is still in that location. So we're just able to see over a longer period of time how the land is being used. Another way that this is manifest is in terms of the cubs that Anjali mentioned. So it's almost impossible to see here, but behind that male, there is actually a female, a resident female. This is very within the Dunkeld tea estate area, and they're actually courting. I know, I mean, she is actually there. I don't know if you can probably just take my word for it. So the male and the female are there. They were courting, and this was in March of last year. That female we knew from previous cameras, and this is her with her cub, a male cub who was probably roughly 14 months old or so at this stage. So this was in April. This was a month after we'd seen her with that male, and she's still with her cub. A short while after that, a couple of months after that, we started seeing this cub now on his own a little more. He wasn't always with the mother anymore. He was he was by himself now with increasing frequency. And again, this is that crepuscular time, just after 6 p.m. when you're getting more, the increased movement of leopards up in this area. So this was June. Then in July, which is basically 4 months after we saw the male and the female together in courtship, we saw the female here with obvious signs from her teats that she was nursing, that she had young cubs, very small cubs. Leopard gestation period's about 3 months, 90 to 95 days. So whether or not it was that exact male at that exact time that's the father, we're not sure, because female leopards do mate with multiple males in order to try and confuse paternity, because there is killing of cubs by males at times. So we don't obviously know whether he's the father, but it is interesting. The timing is sort of suggestive. And then, of course, a couple months after that, we managed to get her with the 2 cubs. So this is sort of the apex of the story, because after that, then we saw them for another month, together quite frequently on these cameras using this area. And incidentally, at the same time, there was another adult female with also 2 cubs of her own within the same area. Whether she was related to this female, again, we don't know, but it was interesting. So at one point, there was 2 adult males, 2 adult females, and 4 cubs within a small area in this part of the landscape, which is, for this area, quite unusual, it seems like. But of course, then, nature intruded, and sometime in November, one of the cubs disappeared. Sometime in between this photo and that photo. And then that's what we got from then on, was the mother with a single cub up until sometime in January of this year. And unfortunately, at that time, the second cub disappeared. And now the female is back by herself 8 months after having 2 cubs. She's somehow lost them both, and that's how she is now. This was taken in June of this year, the same female. So it's very interesting to see what's happening there. We know that they're having cubs, they're reproducing on the landscape, not 1 but 2 sets within this area. But unfortunately, these cubs, didn't last particularly long. So what is it? This raises even more questions about the landscape. How did they die? Were they killed by a male leopard? Was it snares? As we saw in that video, we do find snares across the landscape. And those small ones might even be sufficient for a cub. Lots of questions that come up. So these are things that we want to try and address as we go forward with this sort of work here. Now, since we're on sad stories about leopards, this one's potentially worse, so I'll warn you in advance. But this is the reality of the systems. This is an unprotected landscape. The reason that we went up to this place in the first place and started doing this work was because of all of these animals that had been killed, caught in snares in 2016. We were very happy to see that in 2017 and 2018, there were far fewer that were reported anyway. And we also saw from the long-term monitoring that we were having the same leopards for a long period of time, for that entire 2-year period. So we weren't seeing a high turnover that we were expecting we might see. However, you still do see some things you don't want to. This was a young female that came in November of last year. The second time we saw her was in January of this year, and at that point she had a snare around her waist. And from previous experience with these things, we expected her to not last very long at all. I mean, she had very bad injuries. It was quite tight, and usually that causes bad internal damage. we were very surprised to see her again a month later, still with the snare around her waist. And at this point, obviously, we started thinking about how to intervene and what we could try and do. The problem is that the routes that these animals take, I mean, it's not a regular thing. This is a full month between coming to this location. And we did get her one more time at the end of the month, and that was the last time we saw her until she was found in May of this year. And obviously, it had been 5 months that she had spent wandering about with this snare around her waist, right? So this is still an issue on the landscape. So like I said, we do these awareness talks. We try, and we've had a student actually out who's done an analysis and looking at where these animals are being killed, and compared to where people are, compared to different landscape attributes. And essentially, people are, not surprisingly, they're putting the snares in the same places that the leopards are kind of looking for prey and spending their time away from people in the forest patches. So it's typically the forest patches which are targeted. So the leopards are almost, in a sense, competing with people for the same prey. And the people are putting snares, obviously, to capture wild boar or deer, and leopards sometimes are getting captured within those. Like I said, this is the one that we've come across in the 2 years that we've been doing this work, and lots of different animals. But it is sobering, obviously, to see. In more positive news, this is a bit of an update on some additional information that we've got on that adult male that we showed earlier in that video, where we had this sort of what we acknowledged to be an absolute minimum home range area within the landscape. That was from the first phase of the work in 2016, and we did additional work in 2017 further down the Bogo-Antalawa Valley. And not surprisingly, we picked the same guy up, in all various different cameras in that area as well, which indicates obviously that his range is significantly larger than what was indicated, than that minimum that we saw in the first phase. A leopard range is typically very strongly linked to prey density, prey availability. Obviously, the more prey available, the higher the density of leopards. And the higher the density of leopards, the smaller the home range. So this fellow has a home range which is considerably larger than what you see in protected areas. For instance, in Yala National Park, adult male home range is about 22, 25 square kilometers. That polygon that you see is already 32 square kilometers. Now we're stretching down to the southeast quite considerably. And yet during this whole time, he was still within the same area in the core. So this was the first picture that we got back in August of 2016, and this was last month in July of 2018. Same fellow, same place. So he's still persisting on the landscape. And again, this is interesting information that the long-term monitoring cameras can give. How frequent is a turnover in this sort of a system? How often does an adult resident male get moved out or die or shift off, that kind of thing? And now we've also got him right around our base at Dunkeld. So whether we're trying to study him or he's actually coming to study us, it's a bit indeterminate at this point.
Right. So to end with, a lot of leopard there. Obviously, it's not all about leopards, right? We all know that. We happen to be studying them, so that's why we're presenting it this way. We happen to realize, too, the value of it as an umbrella species for conservation on a small island like Sri Lanka, where it's the only large apex predator terrestrial that we have. So leopard work and leopard conservation obviously is important if we want to continue to have leopards persisting on the landscape here in Sri Lanka. Right? So it's important for itself. It's to have leopards here as well. And as well, it plays this umbrella role. So by default, it will also then be providing the landscape, the protection level for much larger biodiversity here on this island, so that we can continue as an island to hold what we still hold today. And it is going fast. We all know there's post-war development happening quickly. Overnight, some of these areas are being lost to us. Oops, sorry. Stuck again. Right. So moving forward now, we've talked all about the leopard, the umbrella value of it and everything. But like I said again, it's not only the leopard story, right? In some areas in Sri Lanka, as you saw from the distribution map, we don't have leopards on the landscape anymore. We used to in Colombo and in the west half of the western province, but we don't anymore. So obviously then this strategy cannot be used in these areas. And of course we want to look for the whole island. Conservation should occur in all of these multiple systems. So then in that case scenario, we have to look at something else. So here in Colombo, obviously the fishing cat factors in. The urban fishing cat project that Anya is doing right now factors into that. If you look at the distribution map again that we showed earlier on in this talk, there are certain gaps across the island where we don't really have leopard, and that is basically the rice belt of Sri Lanka, where there's heavy agriculture, Anuradhapura area, for example. And that analysis we talked about also shows that leopards actually are avoiding agricultural areas because obviously rice being the way the system, the way it is here, there is no prey in these areas, or very low prey base in there. So we don't really have leopards in some of those areas, which ironically enough is where most of the elephant issue is occurring in some of these areas. So obviously multiple strategies do need to be looked at. And it's not just, one side that can do this. We've talked about some of the data we've got, some of the science behind all of it, but Andrew also touched on community involvement here. And in these past few years, especially with some of the media coverage that has come to not just leopards, but in general, wildlife, human issues that have occurred, it escalates. It makes people afraid, people who live close by to some of these. Many of us here in this room know how we have to deal with sort of the day after this kind of incident occurs. So working on the landscape closely, ensuring that, for millennia we have lived in close coexistence with wildlife here. So continuing that, taking that forward. If we want to continue to have that, then people, not just us here in the room today, but everybody across the island needs to also want that. Sorry, this is, okay. And finally, habitat conservation. Obviously, as you saw from that analysis, forests, the size of the forest, the contiguity of the forest, there's all of these finite little parts here that really play a key role on a small island such as Sri Lanka. So just, ensuring that we can regenerate small patch forests that we've spoken about, we've given examples, our remaining ridges. Many people seated here may own some of these patch forests. The fact that they, in fact, may not have leopard. So actually, where there isn't leopard is also an important gap that needs to be considered. We showed you Agrapathana, a small study site we worked in, Rohan Pethyagura's land at that time. He went in there for frogs, for small things, yet we found leopard there. Because as the habitat regenerates and come forward, perhaps then the larger mammals will come in too. So looking at gaps where leopards actually are not is also a real positive for conservation and a focus that could work. And this whole concept of something, again, we're just starting to look at now is the stepping stones for conservation. It is being used in other parts of the world where these little patches can then form these strings, stepping stones as it were, for dispersal, for larger animals as well as small species to move through, to go into our larger protected forests, but also to reside within these smaller stepping stones. And that's it. Thank you.